archaeologists had been searching for something that seemed impossible to find. They knew it existed. They knew it had to be out there, somewhere beneath the Egyptian sand. But no matter how hard they looked, no matter how many expeditions they launched, the tomb of Pharaoh Thutmose II remained hidden from the world. Now here's what makes this so frustrating. We actually have his mummy. It was discovered way back in 1881, stuffed into a secret cave with dozens of other royal bodies. Ancient priests had moved all these pharaohs there, thousands of years ago, to protect them from grave robbers. So we know Thutmose II was real. We know he ruled Egypt about 3,500 years ago. We know he was married to one of the most powerful women in ancient history, a queen named Hatshepsut, who would later become Pharaoh herself. But his original tomb? The place where he was first buried with all his treasures and sacred objects? Nobody could find it. And this wasn't just any pharaoh we're talking about. Thutmose II belonged to the famous 18th dynasty, the same royal family that produced Tutankhamun, the boy king whose tomb stunned the world when it was opened in 1922. Every other king from this dynasty had their burial place discovered. Every single one except Thutmose II. He was the last missing piece of the puzzle, and that puzzle had been driving Egyptologists crazy for generations. Think about that for a second. We're talking about a mystery that lasted longer than most countries have existed. Archaeologists dedicated their entire careers to solving it. Some of them went to their graves never knowing the answer. The Valley of the Kings, that famous stretch of desert near Luxor, where pharaohs built their elaborate underground tombs, had been searched over and over again. Teams from every major university in the world had taken their shot. They found queens, they found nobles, they found officials. But the king himself? Nothing. And then, in October 2022, something unexpected happened. A team led by a Scottish archaeologist named Piers Litherland was working in an area west of the Valley of the Kings. They weren't looking for Thutmose II. That's the thing you need to understand. They weren't even looking for a pharaoh at all. This particular valley had always been associated with royal women, the wives and daughters of kings. That's where queens got buried, not pharaohs. So when Litherland's team uncovered the entrance to a tomb, everyone assumed it belonged to a woman. Maybe one of the wives of Thutmose III, maybe some forgotten princess. The location made perfect sense for that kind of discovery. Queen Hatshepsut's own tomb was nearby. Everything about the situation pointed toward a female burial. But something felt off from the very beginning. The entrance was bigger than it should have been. The passageway going down into the earth was longer and steeper than you'd expect for a Queen C's tomb. These details might seem small, but in archaeology, small details are everything. They're the difference between finding pottery shards and finding history. For nearly 3 years, Litherland and his joint British-Egyptian team worked at that site. 3 years of carefully removing rubble, bucket by bucket. 3 years of documenting every stone, every fragment, every inch of progress. This is the part of archaeology that movies never show you. It's not all dramatic discoveries and golden treasures. Most of the time, it's slow, careful, back-breaking work in the heat of the Egyptian desert. The tomb had clearly been through something terrible. Ancient floods had torn through the chambers at some point, destroying most of what lay inside. The walls, which would have once been covered in beautiful paintings and sacred texts, showed only fragments of decoration. Whatever treasures might have been buried with the tomb's occupant were long gone, either swept away by water or stolen by grave robbers thousands of years ago. But then Litherland made it into the main burial chamber, and what he saw on the ceiling stopped him cold. There, painted on the stone above his head, was a blue background covered with yellow stars. Now, if you don't know much about ancient Egypt, that might sound like a big deal. But Litherland knew exactly what he was looking at, and it changed everything. In ancient Egyptian tradition, that specific design, blue with yellow stars, was reserved exclusively for kings. Queens didn't get it. Nobles didn't get it. Only pharaohs had the right to that celestial ceiling, watching over them for eternity. Litherland had just walked into a king's tomb. A king's tomb that nobody knew existed. A king's tomb in a valley where no king was ever supposed to be buried. When he finally emerged from underground that day, his wife was waiting for him outside. And according to Litherland himself, all he could do was burst into tears. Years later, he would describe that moment as emotionally extremely turbulent. That's the kind of thing that happens when you suddenly realize you might have just made the discovery of a lifetime. But here's the thing. They still didn't know which king they'd found. The tomb had been so badly damaged by those ancient floods that most of the identifying information was gone. The mummy wasn't there. The coffin wasn't there. All the objects that would normally tell you who was buried in a place like this had either been destroyed or removed long ago. The team spent months searching through the debris on the chamber floor. They found fragments of shattered pottery. They found pieces of plaster that had fallen from the walls. They found broken bits of what had once been sacred vessels. And then, finally, they found something that would solve a mystery over a century old. Among the rubble were fragments of alabaster jars. These containers would have originally held precious ointments and sacred oils meant to protect the pharaoh in the afterlife. Most of the jars were destroyed, but the pieces that survived still had their inscriptions intact. And when the hieroglyphics were translated, the words carved into that stone told an incredible story. The name on those jar fragments was Thutmose II, not a queen, not a princess, the missing pharaoh himself. The inscription called him the deceased king, leaving no room for doubt. Even more remarkably, another name appeared alongside his, the name of the woman who had arranged his burial. Hatshepsut, his wife and half-sister, the future pharaoh who would become one of Egypt's most legendary rulers. After 100 years of searching, after countless failed expeditions and disappointed archaeologists, the last missing tomb of the 18th dynasty had been found, and it was found in the last place anyone would have thought to look. The Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities made the official announcement in February 2025, exactly 100 years after the golden age of Egyptian archaeology had begun with the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb. It felt almost poetic, like the desert itself had been waiting for the right moment to give up its secret. But finding the tomb was only the beginning of the story. Because what the archaeological team discovered inside those damaged chambers raised questions that nobody expected. Why was Thutmose II buried so far from the Valley of the Kings? Why did his wife Hatshepsut put him in a tomb clearly designed for someone of lower status? And most importantly, where did all his burial treasures actually end up? The answer to that last question might be the most shocking part of this entire discovery. Because Piers Litherland believes those treasures still exist. He thinks they're still out there, buried beneath the Egyptian sand, waiting to be found. And he might already know exactly where they are. In Part 1, we talked about how archaeologists finally found the lost tomb of Pharaoh Thutmose II after 100 years of searching. They found it in a valley where no king was ever supposed to be buried. They identified it through fragments of broken alabaster jars that still carried his name after 3,500 years. But the tomb itself was almost empty. The mummy was gone. The treasures were gone. The walls were damaged beyond recognition. So what actually happened inside that tomb? Where did everything go? And why was this powerful pharaoh buried in such a strange location in the first place? The answers to these questions turned out to be more shocking than anyone expected. Let's start with the location. Thutmose II ruled Egypt during the 18th dynasty, one of the most powerful periods in ancient history. His father, Thutmose I, was a legendary warrior king who expanded Egypt's borders and brought enormous wealth into the kingdom. His wife, Hatshepsut, would go on to become one of the most successful pharaohs ever to sit on the throne. This was a family of incredible power and influence. So why would someone from this dynasty be buried in a valley associated with queens and princesses, instead of in the Grand Valley of the Kings, where his ancestors rested? The archaeological team found the answer written in the inscriptions they recovered from those broken jars. Hatshepsut herself had arranged the burial. She personally chose this location for her husband's eternal resting place. Now here's where things get interesting. At the time of Thutmose II's death, Hatshepsut wasn't pharaoh yet. She was the king's wife, a powerful position, but not the highest one. Evidence suggests she originally planned to be buried near her husband in that same valley. There's actually an unfinished tomb, about 1,600 feet away, that was clearly built for her during this period. But then something changed. About 7 years after her husband died, Hatshepsut did something almost unheard of in Egyptian history. She declared herself pharaoh, not regent, not queen, but the actual king of Egypt, with all the titles and powers that came with it. And once she became pharaoh, she moved her burial plans to the Valley of the Kings, where she belonged as a ruling monarch. Her husband stayed behind in that quiet valley, almost forgotten by history. But the location isn't even the most dramatic part of this story. What really shocked the archaeological team was what happened to the tomb shortly after Thutmose II was buried there. See, whoever chose that spot made a terrible mistake. The tomb was built directly beneath 2 natural waterfalls and at the bottom of a slope. In ancient times, Egypt's climate was much wetter than it is today. When the rains came, water would have poured down that hillside like a river. Archaeological evidence suggests the tomb flooded within just 6 years of the burial. 6 years. Imagine spending months preparing a pharaoh's eternal resting place, filling it with gold and sacred objects and everything he would need in the afterlife, and then watching helplessly as floodwaters destroyed it all. The ancient Egyptians didn't just abandon the tomb, though. They tried to save what they could. Priests, probably working under Hatshepsut's orders, entered the flooded chambers and removed the pharaoh's mummy, along with whatever treasures could be salvaged. They worked in darkness, wading through water, grabbing what they could reach. That's why the team found so many broken fragments on the floor. Things were being grabbed quickly, desperately. Some objects shattered as they were pulled from the flood. The mummy of Thutmose II eventually ended up in that secret cave where it was discovered in 1881, stored alongside dozens of other pharaohs who had been moved there for protection over the centuries. But the treasures that were rescued from the flood, those went somewhere else entirely. And this is where the story takes its most exciting turn. While surveying the landscape around the tomb, Piers Litherland noticed something unusual. About 75 feet away from the original burial chamber sits a massive mound of limestone and rubble. We're talking about a pile that rises 75 feet into the air, a small mountain of stone sitting in the middle of the desert. At first glance, it might look natural, just another hill in a landscape full of hills. But Litherland studied it carefully, and what he found convinced him that this mound is anything but natural. The stones were placed there deliberately. The amount of material involved would have taken enormous effort and expense to move. Nobody builds something like that without a very good reason. Litherland believes that mound is hiding a second tomb. He thinks that when the original burial flooded, the ancient Egyptians didn't just rescue the treasures and scatter them randomly. They built a new secret tomb and buried everything there. Then they piled thousands of tons of rock on top of it to make sure grave robbers would never find it. Think about what that could mean. We're talking about the burial goods of a pharaoh from the 18th dynasty, the same period that gave us the treasures of Tutankhamun. When Howard Carter opened King Tut's tomb in 1922, he found over 5,000 artifacts, including that famous golden death mask. The treasures filled multiple rooms and took years to catalog. If Litherland is right about this hidden chamber, it could contain similar riches. And unlike Tut's tomb, which had been partially robbed in ancient times, this one may have remained completely sealed for 3,500 years. protected by that mountain of stone, untouched by grave robbers, waiting in the darkness beneath the desert. In Litherland's own words, if there is a second tomb down there, it is likely to be complete and undisturbed. A team is currently working on excavating that mound. It's slow going because they have to be careful not to damage whatever might be underneath. We're talking about 23 meters of material that needs to be removed carefully, layer by layer. But preliminary evidence suggests they're onto something real. Ground-penetrating scans have shown anomalies beneath the rubble that are consistent with a man-made structure. Meanwhile, the original tomb continues to reveal new secrets. Scientists have been analyzing the artifacts that were recovered, and even the broken fragments tell an amazing story. A walking stick inscribed with Thutmose II's name turned out to be made from African blackwood, a precious material that had to be imported from thousands of miles away. This tells us about the trade networks that existed during this period, the connections between Egypt and distant lands. Pieces of the tomb's ceiling decoration have been pieced back together, revealing sections of an ancient text called the Anduat. This was a sacred guide to the afterlife, describing the journey of the sun god through the underworld each night. In ancient Egypt, only pharaohs were allowed to have this text in their tombs. Finding it here provided yet another confirmation that this was indeed a king's burial chamber. The discovery also raises new questions about one of Egypt's most fascinating relationships. Thutmose II and Hatshepsut were not just husband and wife. They were half-siblings, both children of Thutmose I, but by different mothers. Their marriage was political, designed to strengthen claims to the throne. And yet the inscriptions suggest Hatshepsut genuinely cared about her husband's burial, personally overseeing the construction of his tomb, and later trying to save his remains when disaster struck. What happened between them? Why did she leave him, buried in that quiet valley, even after she became Pharaoh herself? Why didn't she move him to a grander tomb befitting his status? These are questions that archaeologists are still trying to answer. The excavation continues through 2025 and beyond. The team plans to fully investigate the mysterious mound and search for additional royal tombs in the area. Some experts believe the original burial places of other early 18th dynasty pharaohs might be hidden in the same valley, waiting to be discovered. After nearly 200 years of exploration, the sands of Egypt clearly still have secrets to share. The missing pharaoh has finally been found, but his treasures may still lie hidden beneath a mountain of stone. And if Piers Litherland is right, the most stunning discovery of all might still be waiting in the darkness, untouched for 3,500 years.